Hello and welcome to another chat. This one's going to be about Soviet Ekranoplans. I did a video recently on the new Chinese wings and ground effect vehicle, also known as Ekranoplan. That's pretty cool, interesting topic. Of course, I touched on the Soviet Ekranoplans of the Cold War. They are also really interesting. I suggested a video, people seem to be interested, so here it is. There are actually quite a few videos on this topic on YouTube. It's going to be a bit different. I'm going to cover more of the unusual types, less well-known types, not just regurgitate um, fanboy stuff about how great the Ekranoplans were. I'm H.I. Sutton, independent defense analyst. I normally focus on unconventional naval warfare capabilities and strategy. This definitely fits into unconventional capabilities. It's unscripted, unedited, none of that AI rubbish. Let's get on with it. In my previous video, I mentioned that Alexander Lippisch was the father of modern Ekranoplans or wings and ground effect vehicles. I stand by that. He was a German designer in World War II, famous for the Messerschmitt Comet rocket-powered fighter, and also somewhat the father of the Delta wing. After the war, like a lot of German scientists, he moved to America and was designing aircraft there. Particularly, he was designing wings and ground effect vehicles. At the same time that he was doing that, there was a guy in Russia doing pretty much the same thing, Alexeyev. I don't know how much Alexeyev knew of Lippisch, but it's clear it was parallel development. So while Lippisch, I'd say, is the father of wings and ground effect, he wasn't the only person. And of course, there were other people, you know, even before then, ground effect was known. It's just that it was the early 60s when it became viable, let's say. Alexeyev wasn't really thought of as an aircraft designer. He was known for hydrofoils, boats with wings, essentially. During World War II, he's developing torpedo-armed ones, and in the 50s, he designed the passenger ones that continue on to this day. Evolutions of this 1950s design are still in the water. They're really interesting, but we're going to look at his aircraft. This was the first of his designs, 1961. It took to the air in July, and he himself piloted it. So pretty brave. Definitely an unusual looking aircraft. You can see the jet engine sort of strapped on behind the cockpit there. He had a different aerodynamic layout to Lippisch. Lippisch, the father of Delta Wing, as well as the father of Wings and Ground Effect, he used like a reverse delta, sort of a backward triangle. Whereas the Soviet design had essentially a box wing, a square wing. So quite different. And actually, the Russian one flew first. So contemporary designs, Russia isn't copying Lippisch that much. In fact, development was incredibly fast in the Soviet Union. This is the SM-2, flew next year. A few differences. Firstly, the jet engine is integral, much more streamlined appearance, much more finished design. More significantly, the tail plane has been moved up to the top of the tail, so essentially a T-tail. This became characteristic of the Soviet Ekranoplans. In fact, it's pretty characteristic of Ekranoplans or wings and ground effect in general. And another significant improvement there was a jet exhaust forward to blow air under the wings. Wings and ground effect, I should clarify, is when you fly incredibly low, so low that you don't get the same drag as a regular airplane. It's basically a low drag flight. It's called ground effect, and it's like a cushion. It's like riding on a cushion. You see how low this aircraft is here? To be in ground effect, you have to be below approximately half the wingspan, so half the width of the aircraft. That's really low. Makes it incredibly efficient. Pretty cool as well. This is the SM-3, a further improvement the next year. Again, very smooth aircraft. Notice the wing shape, just experimental. It's getting a bit different. It's got a jet engine in the nose to blow the air under the wing. And the SM-4, bigger, better, flew in 1963. So really quick development. This has A jet engine in the nose and a jet engine in the tail. So one for lift and one for propulsion. Also, sort of a staggered cockpit. I'm not sure why that the cockpit was like that, but pretty cool. And 1963, the SM5, much bigger, much more sort of polished design. This actually also illustrates the dangers of ekranoplans. They have to fly incredibly low. And this crashed a couple of years after it was built. A headwind caused the aircraft to gain altitude and it lost ground effect. Rather than reduce power and sit back down onto the water, the pilots tried to power out of it and they lost control. It was replaced by the SM-8 a couple of years later, more or less the same thing, a few refinements. There were a couple more designs around this time. I'm not going to cover these little propeller things. Let's get on to the proper stuff. Where it was heading very quickly was building a monstrous, supersized Ekranoplan, the largest aircraft in the world at the time. See here, it's got 10 jet engines, four each side. They're actually in front of the wing, above and in front, and then two on the tail. When it was first built or first flown in 1966, it was the largest aircraft ever built, and it remained so until late 1980s. To clarify, it wasn't the widest. The only dimension it wasn't the largest in the world would be wingspan. Something like a B-52 or something like that would be wider, but much smaller in every other respect. This was the heaviest, longest aircraft by far. Actually, when it was first discovered by American intelligence, it was dubbed the Caspian Sea Monster. This is a keyhole satellite image declassified by the CIA. The notes on it suggested it was taken in 1984, but I'm not convinced. I think this is actually a much older image, just a mistake in the labeling probably. But you can see it was being the largest aircraft in the world when they first looked at it. Analysts were very perplexed. It was tested on the Caspian Sea, so hence the Caspian Sea Monster name. Here it is again towards the end of its testing in 1979. Just to detail, the jet engines have been moved forward and given sort of spray guards on all the engines to reduce water coming in. A common problem with jet-powered seaplanes of all types. So what? Incredible development. We can say how wonderful and how impressive they are, but why? Ekranoplans are much faster than boats. That's sure, hundreds of kilometers an hour, and they're more efficient than aircraft. Quite remarkable. And in a military context, I don't want to say they're immune to mines, but they can fly straight over minefields. So you think there must be a military utility. Now, if you're a huge fan of Ekranoplans, you might want to skip the next minute or so. Because I am a defense analyst, so I've got to also point out that while they're faster than boats, they're still a lot slower than aeroplanes. They're incredibly fragile. And by that I mean that they need the sea to be very calm. In particular, when they're turning, they bank like an aircraft. So their wingtip lower can become very close to the water. And if it touches the water, there can be a disaster. Can sort of cartwheel into the sea and crash. And that means they're not suitable for use overland. Now, to clarify, some Ekranoplans have a much wider wingspan to enable them to also be able to fly overland, but less efficiently than a regular aircraft. Not so with these Soviet ones that we're talking about here, and even the ones where they can do that. It's hard, you can't really say they're the best of both worlds. They're more the worst of both worlds. As a defense analyst, I think they're pretty rubbish. I can't think of use cases where they are truly better than a flying boat or a hovercraft or one of the other options. But they are exceedingly cool. And for that, let's carry on. So why aren't we just going to do a whole video on this single Ekranoplan? I'm going to move on quickly because the Soviets did. It was just a test aircraft, and they wanted to convert this technology into military advantage. So they started looking for a role for the Ekranoplans, and one of those roles was assault transport. This is an artist's impression, US military artist's impression from 1980s. Love this type of painting, big influence on my artworks. But the first idea seems to have been to use it as an anti-submarine warfare vessel. This is the original KM design and or an evolution of it. Note that unusually there's instead of jets, it's got turboprops on the tail. So I'm not entirely sure um, what the designation of this project was, but it wasn't built. It also has what appears to be a dipping sonar, interesting capability. It would have to land to use this surely, but it's essentially an anti-submarine warfare uh, vessel. They didn't build this. Instead, they started building transports. And as you'd expect, they didn't just build the full size one. They started with a sub-size prototype, the SM-6 Eaglet. It first flew in 1972. See the turboprop in the tail. Pretty cool looking little aircraft, to be honest. Here it is again, and background image is very, very sort of pixelated. Sorry about that, but I think it's still a great photo. See the smaller eaglet in front of the KM, the biggest aircraft in the world at the time. Where that was leading was a transport one, the A-90. This is one of the better known plans. Four of them were built, so it achieved a limited operational capability. Interesting design. Note that the jet engine is in the nose. There's two of them to push air underneath the wings. We've also got the cockpit and the radar in the nose and a kind of sort of seaplane boat-like uh, shape underneath the nose. All that is a problem if you're going to trying to be a transport aircraft. What they did to get around the fact that you're going to fly onto a beach and unload stuff is they made the whole front of the aircraft um, open, sort of shift sideways. Very unusual. Could carry armored vehicles or troops. I think there was a couple of different internal arrangements, not being able to really pin that down. Also, from this photo, just interested, you can see the forward gun turret. Very unusual for an aircraft at that time, just a cool detail. So four of them were built and they were sort of limited operational capability. Definitely got NATO and the West thinking. But they weren't the end of the story. There was a ship killer. That basically, the idea to use Ekranoplans in kind of like a missile corvette, more like a missile corvette, more like an alternative to a boat than an alternative to an aircraft. This is the Loon, which was built in 1987. It's actually after um, Alexeyev, saying that wrong, but I'll carry on. After he had passed away, but it's definitely one of his designs or one of his design lineage. Notice the missiles on the back. They are SSN-22 Sunburn missiles, popularly known as the Mosquet. This is now a bit forgotten, but in the 90s, this was a huge deal. It's one of Russia's most capable missiles of the Cold War era. It was a supersonic anti-ship missile flying at Mach 2.3, about 120 kilometers, which doesn't sound very much today, but was definitely long range for the time, and a heavy warhead. It can fly at 7 meters altitude, so sea skimming in its final phase. And I think I've got to confirm this actually, but the missiles were able to collaborate with each other. I want to double check that, but I think it's the case. I'm going to carry on. Here's my drawing of it. A sketch, MS Paint, of course, not AI. I saw a terrible AI artwork getting lots of clicks on Twitter earlier. This isn't one of those. So the main detail, there's the missile battery on the back, 6 of them. What's also interesting is it needed a lot of radars. So you've got this sort of very ugly appearance of radomes. The large one on the tail is for the radar that controls the missiles, but you also have navigation and so on. Also had two gun turrets, one in the tail where you often see them on aircraft, but also a forward-firing one underneath the missile battery. That one is visible in most photographs, but I don't think people notice it. I certainly overlook it most of the time, so I just point it out. Two of them were built, but the second one had a different role. It was going to be a search and rescue vessel. So the idea flies a bit like a seaplane, lands and rescues people. And you can, because of its capability of carrying unusual shaped objects, it can carry stuff on the back and things that you wouldn't necessarily do with a regular aircraft. Okay, something completely different because there was another designer of Ekranoplans in USSR at the same time, and he was responsible for this thing, whatever you call it. He was um, Robert Bartini. He was born in Hungary, actually, and he was a similar age to Lippisch, a bit older than Alexeyev. I don't know quite how you describe this aircraft, but it was a form of Ekranoplan. Actually, his first design was definitely weird, but looked a bit different. The Beriev BE-1, that was built in 1964, so a couple of years after the first of the Alexeyev SM series. See, it's quite different. It looks like it's got floats, but actually, it's also got hydrofoils. I don't think we see this in any subsequent designs. Definitely interesting. Um, Martini still worked with Beriev, but the subsequent designs were much more his. And it's kind of got a space age look to it in a weird way. Maybe there's a bit of Star Wars, but I think it looks a lot like Thunderbird 6, gives me similar vibes. Interesting here, this is a late photograph. Initially, it had inflatable um, floats, which is quite a good idea. Um, but it must have not worked that well because by this time they've given it solid floats. Also, it has additional two jet engines, one each side of the nose to send air underneath the wing, similar to the Alexeyev designs. So this is a late photo. Here it is now. It's in a museum rotting away. Its wings removed, bits, engines, and so on. It looks like something out of a sci-fi movie. There's quite a few photographs of this as well photographed, let's say. That brings us on to the other Ekran plans. Where are they now? Well, the Eaglet, which was that single engine or turboprop transport one, the prototype, I think it's been scrapped. I've seen some photos of it on display, but I think that's actually quite dated. It's probably been scrapped. Here it is on Google Earth in pieces from, if my memory serves me right, 2005. It's gone after that. The A-90s fared much better. There was four built, and several of them are on display in Moscow and elsewhere. The one that was being built for search and rescue was never finished, and although there was constant sort of talk of bringing it into service, how great, and people trying to sell it and everything, it's just sitting there in the factory that built it, rusting away really. And lastly, the Loon, the missile-armed version, that had a quite a sad sort of end. It's now a museum. This a couple of years ago, the museum, very poor museum it seems, towed it from where it's been stored and sort of just pulled it up on a beach with a digger. It nearly got destroyed by storms. This picture looks quite sad. Since then, it has been dragged ashore and is being renovated. So I suppose there might be a positive outcome. Since the Cold War, the idea of Ekranoplans hasn't stopped. The main designers had passed away, but there have been a series of new designs. Mostly they're much smaller. The most adventurous one is a new one called the Orion 20. There's quite a lot of paper designs that I don't want to really cover. They're fanciful. These are pretty good. The Orion 20 looks like a decent project. Note the inflatable um, or rubberized uh, floats. Okay, that was my talk on Ekranoplans. Like I say, not AI, just a guy talking, unscripted, unedited. Please like, subscribe. Also, give me suggestions for videos, but I'm going to return, I think, to more current affairs in my next video. Thank you. Bye.